Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sicoria.
Dr. Nate Call and John Borrero, thanks for joining me today on the Behavioral Observations Podcast. This is a special episode in many ways. It's the 25th Inside JABA Series. It's the last one that John Borrero will be participating in. His term as editor-in-chief has come and gone. John, it's been really fun doing these episodes with you, and I can't believe we're going to be on to the third term of editorship for JABA. It's also special because we have you chose a banger of a paper to go out with, so we'll get into that shortly. But the paper is by the aforementioned Dr. Call, Scholarship as an Operating, and colleagues, I should say, Scholarship as an Operating Class, Strategies and Tactics for Increasing Dissemination of Applied Behavior Analysis. So just for the listeners' interest, I was telling John and Nate before I hit record here that this is one of those papers that you really want to print out and go over, set some time aside, get a notebook, get a highlighter. It is content rich. I learned a bunch of new terms. We're all going to learn here together shortly. A lot of good stuff to get into, and I think a kind of a unique message as it relates to dissemination. So, Nate, we're going to get into this great paper in just a moment here, but first, I wanted to give you the opportunity to, given that your term has expired here as editor-in-chief, I'm kind of curious what that experience was like for you. Certainly you've probably read a gazillion papers. I'm sure you were doing so previous to that anyway in other editorship roles, but I don't know. Tell us what the experience was like.
I appreciate the opportunity to describe that experience, Matt. It has been a tremendous honor to be able to serve as editor for JABA and to serve SAAB, which is the Society for the Experimental Analysis of Behavior, and just the behavior analysis community. I would say, to your point, that the experience has been an education unto itself. I think in that 3-year interval, I read more papers than I have ever read in any other 3-year interval of my professional life, and that includes grad school. So if you think back about how many papers you had to read in grad school, this was just orders of magnitude more than that. And it was really great because I got to learn about topics that I was not particularly intimately familiar with. And I got to meet a whole bunch of new contributors to the journal. And this is really exciting, I think, because those new contributors represent the future of the discipline, both the science and the practice. But I think my understanding of what it meant to be a journal editor changed across my exposure to the task. So I think I understood at the outset that the task would involve determining what did and did not make it into the journal. And that was the part that I expected. And one of my goals in serving as editor was to try to think very critically about the language that we use in our written work and that we've become so accustomed to using. And I think this relates very closely to what we're going to be talking about today, which is the subject of dissemination. There's a paper that I recommend to lots of folks, and it's by Rick Fox. It was published in 1996, and the beginning of the title is Translating the Covenant. And when I think about this paper, the basic premise was that there are features of our technical language that may serve as barriers for positive appraisals of the science and practice of behavior analysis. And I realized that there are different perspectives on this point. There are some who believe that we should stick to our technical vocabulary and have everybody else learn it. But I think that it's important for us to recognize that language evolves. And one of the ways in which I think that's very obvious is that there are new words added to the English language dictionary every year. That is a wild concept to me. We're adding new words to our language every single year. So if our our everyday language changes over time, I think that as behavior analysts, we need to be aware that the language that we use might also need to change over time, but without compromising any of the core principles on which our science and our practice are based. So there's a blog post that I also reference quite frequently from the journal Nature, and I believe it was published in around 2020. And the title of that blog post was Science is Getting Harder to Read. And again, the basic premise here is that the kind of language that we use can influence uptake can influence consumption of our work. So if I can't get through the introduction of a paper without having to check what those 5 or more acronyms mean, I might just give up. I might just stop. So one of the things that we tried to do in my term as editor is to work with authors, particularly for papers that were going to occasion boundary encounters, and Nate will teach us what that term means in a moment. I wanted to work with those authors to try to craft a manuscript that was created in such a way that very smart people that come from a different theoretical orientation could pick up that work, who are concerned with the same socially significant problems, and could take something from that and apply it to their own work. So I think dissemination has been kind of an ongoing emphasis of what I wanted to see accomplished in the journal. I think another very obvious example of the ways in which dissemination is important and can be a barrier is that our journal publishes in English. And for individuals who don't speak English, they may not be able to consume our literature. And for folks who are entering the discipline, the JABA papers are extremely educational. They're extremely informative. So one of the things that we tried to do on that front is to translate papers into Spanish and into simplified Chinese so that broader audience could consume some very important and, in fact, seminal work that appeared in JABA. So there are a number of those papers that are currently on the JABA website, and we hope to be able to make additional translations available in the future. So I think one of the things that I did not fully appreciate about the role of JABA editor, is that it's an exercise in resource management. I had the opportunity to work with editorial assistants, a team of associate editors, a team of editorial board reviewers, guest editors. That's a lot of people. And to be able to manage a system like JABA's with over 300 submissions per year required us to have a lot of redundancies in place to make sure that the trains were moving on time, so to speak. And so I think one of the things that I've learned from this is that one role of the editor involves copy editing and commenting on other people's science and learning from other people's science. But another is that it's kind of like running a small organization. So I left this position with some kind of managerial skills that I didn't think I had before. So the experience has been incredibly, incredibly fruitful and reinforcing for me. I appreciate this venue as a forum to be able to talk a little bit more specifically about some of the papers that appear in JABA. And I just really look forward to seeing what Louis Agopian and his team have in terms of innovations for the future of the journal.
Well said. So yeah, that's was there, you said you got exposure to things that you were unfamiliar with. Does anything come to mind that you feel like you have a greater appreciation for based off of the publications that came across your desk, topic-wise?
Well, topically, I think what I was most excited about seeing are the kinds of papers that are not the typical JABA submissions. And those are the ones that I think kind of stretch what we see in the journal. And I think perhaps I'm speaking out of turn here, but Nate might have something to say about this. When you see a paper appear in the journal that addresses a topic that has not been previously addressed in the journal, that signals to other people that those kinds of papers are welcome in the journal. So for example, if we're making innovations in how individuals can be encouraged to cooperate with, say, a CPAP machine, like some of the work that Dr. Dorothy Lerman just published, now that signals to a broader audience that that kind of work is acceptable for a journal like JABA. So what I appreciated about the opportunity is that you could kind of signal to other authors and scholars, particularly from other areas, that that kind of work, varied work, would be welcome in the journal.
Got it. That's a great example. All right. Well, Nate, we've mentioned your name a number of times here, and so I'd like to give you a chance to actually speak and participate in the podcast. Before we get into the questions, can you give people an idea of, kind of who you are, the type of work you do, and where you do it?
Yeah, sure. So, Nate Call, I'm a professor in the Emory University School of Medicine. And within that role, I am the associate chief for a division of autism and developmental health. So, within the School of Medicine, there's a division in the Department of Pediatrics specifically focused on autism and developmental health. And I help lead that that whole division at the Marcus Autism Center. So Marcus is a center that's been around for about 20, 25 years and provides a lot of behavior analytics services. And so I help lead all of that, as well as conduct research and work within Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, which is our clinical home for a lot of the work that we do. I got started in this field as an undergraduate, like so many of us do, and I think had some experiences that relate to what John was just talking about, which is I think a lot of us get started and we kind of learn about behavior analysis in the sense that these are universal principles of behavior, right? And I just found that really interesting that regardless of the topography or the circumstances, these principles apply. And the idea that the same principles that govern, a rat pressing a lever to, one of the things I have done when I've taught classes before is I've tried to pull examples from the literature of just how varied and diverse the subject matter can be. And one that I love to pull, and I can't remember off the top of my head who the author is, but it was the legislative patterns of the U.S. Congress.
I remember
And
that one. Yeah.
it shows that like the legislative behavior looks like an FI scallop, right? That you see these election intervals and you see a lot of productivity right as they get close to the election season or something like that. And I show that to students and trainees to just say, look, we're talking about rats and your congressman. And some people might say those things are pretty similar, just on lots of different comparisons.
That's right. Get the Venn diagram out, right?
Exactly. Yeah, just so. But I found that to be really
that's a Tom Critchfield paper.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh!
Yep.
If there wasn't that.
2003. Yep.
Yeah, and I found that as a someone who's just getting into the field to be just that's where I think I was hooked, right? And I was at a university where we had access to animal labs, and so I was doing some early work in an animal lab and got exposure to that, and eventually moved to a graduate program where I worked in Center for Disabilities and Development at the University of Iowa, and started to see those same principles applied in ways that really made life changing differences in the lives of people, and that again just further solidified my interest in the field, and so I continue to do some of that work to this day.
Great. So that gives the audience a good idea of your perspective, the type of work you do. So we've teased it enough. So let's get into the paper itself. So again, the title of the paper is Scholarship as an Operating Class, Strategies and Tactics for Increasing Dissemination of Applied Behavior Analysis. So there's been a number of papers in the field and conference presentations, and sometimes I refer to it as almost like hand-wringing about dissemination. Oh, we got to do better with it, dissemination, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not making light of that scholarly work. I'm just, I guess, I don't know. Anyway, I'll try to extract my foot from my mouth here and just ask the question straight up. So what made you want to write, made you want to put forth another work in this topic area, and what makes this paper different than the others?
Well, to your point, first of all, I think major props to the people who've written on these topics before. And you think about some of the papers that, and the authors who've worked on this topic or written on this topic. I think about, Tom Critchfield being a good example of someone who's written on this topic, and Ed Morris and John Bailey. And, I think Fox was mentioned earlier on. There's Derek Reed. There's a lot of people who've written on these kinds of topics, Pat Fryman, who are way smarter and thoughtful on the subject than I am. And so certainly this is something that's been happening in our literature going back quite a ways. Some of those papers I'm just describing, or authors I'm describing, are writing on this topic in the 1980s in some cases. And so in the paper, we kind of get into this in the discussion section towards the end, that one could take a somewhat cynical view and say, well, if writing papers about this issue addressed the issue, then it probably would have gone away by now. I choose to think about it a little bit differently. First of all, I think part of what my co-authors and I were trying to do here is to treat this like a behavior change project, right? And any good behavior change project, those of us who do that kind of work know well that, you don't just introduce, if one of us was trying to teach a skill, you wouldn't just deliver one prompt and then say, well, that didn't work, and just move on with your life, right? That in fact, any good behavior change project requires multiple instances of the exposure to the independent variable, that environments and contingencies change over time, and so require updating and persistence. And so in the sense that we were thinking about this as an issue that needs to be addressed in the field, that was part of it, right? That there is this opportunity to continue to discuss this topic and maybe do it a little bit differently. And in terms of how I think this was different from some of those other papers, and again, to your point, not to take anything away from those, I think just slightly different areas of focus. Some of the papers on this topic are along the lines of what John was describing and have largely focused on things like the language that we use. And in some ways, almost like how do we package our science, right? How do we keep doing the same stuff, but talk about it differently or use certain terms or use certain terms less that might be off putting or certain terms more that might attract people into the field. And so that I think is an important conversation to be having. Less commonly, there are fewer papers, I think, where people have actually looked at, okay, but how are we actually doing the science? What are the questions we're asking as a field? Are we using the right methods? And that goes a little bit beyond just how we talk about some of the science. I was reading a book by Ezra Klein and I think it was Derek Thompson. There's a book called Abundance, and they talk about a lot of topics. But one section of it was referencing this idea of meta science, essentially studying the way science is conducted. And I think that is the exact kind of thing that behavior analysis should be engaged in, right? Science is behavior and therefore amenable to study and amenable to optimization through adapting and altering contingencies and making changes to the environment in ways that can produce better outcomes for science and our science in particular. And that idea was something that we tried to have show up throughout the paper.
So
Nate, I
oh,
have
go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if this is the right time to bring this up, but one of the things that I took from your paper, and it's been described before, but one of the strengths I think of your paper is that you took what I conceptualized as a functional approach to dissemination as opposed to a topographical approach to dissemination. And I have repeatedly found that distinction to be very, very useful. And I'm wondering if you could say a bit about that as kind of a defining foundation of your paper.
Yeah, I think we wanted to start again from this concept that going back to what I was saying earlier, behavior is governed by the same principles regardless of the topography, and that should include the way science is conducted. And we kind of settled on the term scholarly behavior, right? Because really thinking of that as a response class to include selecting research questions, collecting data, designing protocols, writing manuscripts, all of these are part of a response class. And just like you said, starting from a functional approach means trying to understand or at least describe what we could of what are those contingencies that govern that behavior and what when we started to look into that, one of the things we found is that other people have written about this in other disciplines. But some of the ideas and concepts we've tried to introduce, one of the ideas that we've thought through is if you think about what are the reinforcers for most behavior analysts who are engaging in some form of scholarly behavior, it's varied, just like anything, right? I think there's if you want to think at kind of the highest level, I suspect that most people who are engaging in that work, most behavior analysts are interested at the end of the day in their work mattering, right? That it produces some behavior change in someone else. That you do some work and you develop a clinical innovation and that leads to someone else implementing that and having an outcome. That you make some kind of discovery that then is studied that has an impact on the literature going forward. That it matters or it affects the behavior of other people and other scholars and other clinicians. And so we use the term uptake to define that particular type of reinforcer, right? The idea that that work has had some impact on the behavior of someone else. Now, of course, it's way more varied than that. And if you think about, in some ways, more tangible or discrete types of reinforcers, I think that it's likely to be varied. And some of it may be rule governed or private events type reinforcers, but also things that are quite tangible, like, you get to present at a conference. That's cool and fun, and I think reinforcing for a lot of people. But if you think about some of those contingencies and some of those consequences of scholarly behavior, it's worthwhile thinking about, well, where is a lot of this scholarship conducted, and what are those very direct consequences? And things like getting academic promotion. If you're on a tenure track position, there are some contingencies there around being able to produce a certain amount of scholarship or quality of scholarship that very directly impacts your livelihood, your status in ways that can be potent reinforcers. Same thing for if you're a graduate student, right? Being able to complete a thesis means Maybe it's negative reinforcement in the sense that, you don't have to go to classes anymore. You can go get a job. It's going to affect your livelihood. So those, I think, again, are really important reinforcers to acknowledge. But what's interesting is thinking about, well, what are those contingencies? What are the schedules that are governing some of those consequences? And you look at people have made efforts, I think, in some cases to try to differentially reinforce high impact scholarship. There have been things like K values and that kind of thing, or H values, where people actually look at how many citations are being produced by a work of scholarship. That's one idea behind that. But those tend to be pretty clunky. And certainly for behavior analysis, I think we've got a lot of critiques around some of those. If you look at some other work that's happened around those contingencies, it does seem that at the end of the day, it's almost like a DRH, right? It's high rate behavior. It's cranking stuff out. And if you look at, we were able to find some surveys that were done of faculty in just different kinds of departments. And consistently, the number one thing that they reported was that things like tenure, things like promotion really are dependent on the number of publications that are being cranked out by that person. And so that is not always super amenable to also producing work that's going to have high impact or high uptake. The two things sometimes are contradictory, right? That if you're just trying to put out a volume of work, that may not leave a lot of opportunity to be super thoughtful around how are you going to do work that's going to matter, that's going to impact the kinds of constituencies that you're interested in impacting and consumers in that way. So I think those are just some of the ways that our research group thought about this. The last thing that and I know this is a long-winded answer, and I'm sorry about if we need to pause for a moment and take a breath. The other thing that we thought about, though, was this idea that there are also a set of consequences that we labeled, and this is a made-up term, but collective consequences, right? Consequences of scholarship that impact behavior analysts writ large, right? Not necessarily just the individual scholar. And here, I think there are some really classic examples of seminal works in the field that have had huge impact and driven uptake in really significant ways. We talk about two papers. One would be the Awada 1982-1994 paper on functional analysis. Few papers better known within the field, but directly impacted policies in education and other areas that really had an impact on behavior analysis as a field. It led to more behavior analysts getting jobs, more understanding of what behavior analysis is in the lay community, more funding for behavior analytics scholarship. All this came about because of this work. And so it had these collective consequences that impacted people like me. I didn't publish that paper, but that paper had an impact on what kinds of reinforcers were available to me as a result of that. And so one of the things that's interesting is you look at those types of collective consequences and the type of contingency, and you could think of it as a dependent group contingency, right? Essentially, my access to that reinforcer is not dependent on my behavior. It's dependent on the field producing those kinds of works, at least on some type of schedule. And those types of contingencies are notoriously bad for maintaining the behavior of individuals. And I think about it like the prisoner's dilemma, right? Where the best way to maximize reinforcement for me as an individual is to sit back and have someone else produce papers like that or produce scholarship like that, that's going to then produce consequences that I can access, but I can spend my time doing other work at the same time. So for the individual, you can maximize access to those kinds of reinforcers by not doing that kind of work. But if everybody behaves that way, then none of those consequences are produced and nobody accesses them as a result. So there's this dilemma that exists around producing those types of seminal works that are going to drive the field in a positive direction, that almost contradictorily, the individual contingencies don't necessarily support that behavior, but as a group, it's important that behavior be happening. So again, just a handful of the ideas that we talk about in the paper.
I don't know if this is a good time to bring it up or not, but it sounds like there's that one of the things that I thought was interesting is the distinction between distribution and dissemination. And it sounds like you've already kind of outlined some of those things without, tacking it with those terms. But like, I think one of the cool things about this paper is that there's a table on the second page of the paper that, you don't have to, although one should read the paper, but there's a nice handy table that breaks all these terms out with their definitions and things like that. This paper is like a dream if you're if you're having a lab discussion or, you're a teacher or whatever. It's like a ready-made lesson. But anyway, so getting back to the question itself, can you talk about distribution and how sometimes that's conflated with dissemination, and how does and I think you've already outlined some of the reinforcers for each of those, or some of the challenges with each of those, but if you want to add more color to that, feel free to go ahead.
Sure. And again, I think John mentioned at the outset that this was a paper that he and I kind of corresponded about early on. And this was one of the ideas that, I have to give credit to John for turning me on to some of this work. And it comes from a different field, but there's this distinction between when it comes to how work is made available or how it is put out into the world, between distribution and dissemination. And we oftentimes use the word dissemination to refer to any effort to get work out in front of other audiences, right? But the distinction here again is that distribution really is about putting that work out into the world and letting the world decide what to do with it, to consume it or not. But essentially, as the producer of that work, my job is done as soon as I've put it out into the world, as opposed to dissemination, which is really putting a concerted effort into thinking about who's going to consume this work, what's the best way to get it in front of them, how do I craft this work in a way that is going to maximize uptake, getting back to that idea of uptake. I like one of the ideas. Some of my co-authors maybe didn't love this particular analogy that we used from an author, I think it's King et al., who talk about it from the perspective of agriculture, right? And they talk about if you're planting seeds, there's different ways you can do that, right? If one way to do that is to just take a handful of seeds and throw it to the wind, and wherever it lands, and some of those seeds are going to sprout, right? Some land on rocky soil, some land on fertile soil. Some of them are going to sprout, some of them are not. And that's really I think what is most analogous to distribution, right? I've got this idea. I'm going to do the work. I'm going to submit it to the first journal that I think will take it and see that work get published. And then it's up to the world to decide what to do with that, if they consume it or don't, right? Another approach is to kind of go find some soil that is maybe a little bit more fertile and put your seed there. And I think that's kind of your middle ground, right? That's this idea of, well, what are the outlets that typically accept this work? I'm going to put it there where I think it has the best chance of being well received by an audience. And again, I wouldn't call that fully dissemination at that point. It's more likely to sprout or to take root, but may not have the same kind of impact, in the sense that you're generally, in those cases, talking to people who already agree with you, who already know a lot about the subject matter, and who already are likely to be pretty receptive to those ideas that you're putting into the world. And then dissemination is really more so cultivation. It's saying, all right, look, I want this to take root. I have an idea, or I have a message. I'm trying to produce some particular behavior change in a constituency or an audience. How am I best going to influence that audience to take up this idea or take up these results in ways that are going to drive behavior change on their part? Again, that uptake idea. And so I think it's much more there's a lot more thinking on the front end there, as opposed to, and I want to be really clear, I think many of us who have done any kind of publishing in our lives, especially early in our careers, it's really about, you kind of look around and say, where are my opportunities? Because I have to be able to produce stuff in order for these consequences, for me to access these reinforcers. Where are my opportunities? Let's get stuff out so that I can produce. It's oftentimes later in your career where you sit back and think, all right, I have a little bit of an opportunity to be choosy now. I can actually be thoughtful around what are the topics that I want to try to advance, what are the projects that I want to try to move forward. And we should all be so lucky that we have those kinds of opportunities. I don't want to minimize the contingencies that impact behavior early in people's careers by any means. But this idea of dissemination is much more the latter of those. It's thinking through, how am I going to drive uptake? What are the right ways to do that? Who are the audiences? What's going to affect them the most?
I really love this distinction, and I will tell this to anybody who will listen. I think it's one of the most important constructs that behavior analysts, new behavior analysts in particular, can adopt. And one of the things that I take from your description, Nate, is that you were in some parts describing tactics to facilitate dissemination. But what I was getting at with my earlier question about this functional categorization of dissemination is that dissemination is defined functionally. So in the absence of uptake, the position taken by Southwell and colleagues is that we have no dissemination. So I'll say it again. In the absence of uptake, we don't have dissemination. And what you were describing are tactics that can be useful in facilitating that dissemination. But the distinction between distribution and dissemination, I think, is a really important one. So in the absence of getting people to adopt your procedures, to adopt your protocols, then I feel like there's more work left to do. And that's one of the things that I think your paper quite rightly prompts us to be thinking about.
You know, I love that point. And one thing that just to elaborate briefly, one of the things I like about that distinction as well is that dissemination versus distribution, I guess, continuum. It's not really a dichotomy, right? But the other way in which the two differ is who is the agent of uptake? Who is who is the individual that is driving uptake in those two situations? When you think about it from a distribution standpoint, the individual who is responsible for uptake is the audience, right? I'm putting this out in the world. Do with it what you will. Read it, don't. Change your behavior, don't. I did my part by putting it out there. That was the part of that was the role of the scholar there, right? Whether it's taken up or not is really on the audience. Whereas in the case of dissemination, the scholar is the one who's responsible for that, right? Have you really thought through what are the consequences, what are the contingencies that affect the audience that you're trying to produce behavior change in? How are you best going to position that information in a way that is going to be easily consumable, that is going to have maximum impact? And that just feels so much more empowering to me, right? In the sense that if what we really care about is do people actually take up this work, I want to be the one who's accountable for producing that. I want to be the one who, is able to produce that through the work that I'm doing, as opposed to just, it's almost like I think about almost like the Stokes and Bear with generalization, right? It's like train and hope, right? This is disperse and hope. You're just going to throw it to the wind and see what happens. And we all know that just generally the outcome is going to tend to be poor when you do that.
There's this great quote that in the paper, and in summary, although the verbal behavior of some applied behavior analysts suggest that the consequences of dissemination are highly valued, the contingencies for scholarship do not appear to consistently support it. So when I just read that, it was just, again, it's highlighted that those functional relations and kind of tied it up in this really, really nice sentence there. So, and we can elaborate on this further, I suppose. But one of the things that I also took from the paper is that, again, there's no shortage of great terms. A couple of them I'd like you to comment on, Nate. You distinguish between first and second generation innovations and then relate them to what you call boundary encounters. And so I think there's a lot that can be learned just through explaining what those terms are and
Sure.
relating it to this topic.
Yeah, maybe taking boundary encounters first, and John mentioned this earlier. So pulling from some of this literature from outside behavior analysis, people who've written on this subject for other disciplines, boundary encounters are these experiences where an individual from one discipline contacts scholarship from another discipline, right? And at the end of the day, if we're thinking about uptake and especially dissemination, trying to influence audiences outside of our field, that really depends on these boundary encounters, that people from other disciplines are coming into the field and contacting our literature in ways that then can drive uptake. So, and I think some great examples of work that has done that, you talked about work on CPAP machines, right? That's an opportunity to bring people into contact with behavior analytic work in ways that then can drive uptake and collaborations and lots of collective consequences, positive consequences that I think many of us are interested in. So when you take boundary encounters and then step back and say, okay, but how do you drive more boundary encounters? There's really these two types. First of all, there's two different types of boundary encounters, right? And this is where we kind of got creative and invented some terms, tried to differentiate between what we called incoming boundary encounters, which would be bringing people into the behavior analytic literature that exists today. So thinking about journals like JABA and how do we get people to pick up JABA and read JABA that they maybe wouldn't have before, or come in contact with the literature that's published in outlets that commonly produce or disseminate behavior analytic work. And then outgoing boundary encounters, which is the idea of how do we put our behavior analytic work into outlets that don't already regularly serve as a forum for behavior analytic work. And those need different approaches and different strategies for how you're going to go about doing that. I got to be honest with you, when we started talking with John about this paper, a little bit of concern about, okay, we're going to try to put a paper in JABA that says, how do you publish outside of JABA? And how is that going to be received? That creates a little bit of challenge. And how do you phrase those things in ways that it both recognizes this is the right form for so much of this work. But at the same time, and we get into that in the paper a little bit about it's probably different types of work are best suited, different types of scholarship are best suited for each one of those. And one of the ways that I think we talk about how you then drive those different types of boundary encounters is through this idea of second generation innovation. So this relates to how almost the antecedents that precede a particular work of scholarship, right? And think about any work that ever gets published, it's always based on something. Very few ideas just come into the world fully baked and haven't been based on someone's prior work. I think about, again, that Awada 8294 paper, right? I mean, it's an incredibly impactful piece of work, and there's certainly genius there, but there were people doing work in on that topic. Think about Ted Carr and Court, Wolf and Locke and Lovaas and Simmons in their 69 paper. And there were papers that were doing bits and pieces of functional analysis before Awada brought it together and consolidated that into a methodology that really was tight and concise and able to be implemented in a setting like a clinic. That was really something that was incredible. It was based on other work. And that previous work largely was within the same discipline, right? The work that he was basing that on came from other behavior analytic work. And so that would be referred to as first generation innovation, that the antecedents that influence the work of scholarship largely come from within the same discipline or institution or tradition, right? And then second generation is this idea of just the counter to that the antecedents are coming from outside of that discipline or tradition or institution. And again, behavior analysis is replete with examples of second generation innovation where people have taken ideas, concepts, methods, terms, like we're talking about here, from other disciplines and brought those into the field and been able to do something innovative as a result of that. And those second generation innovations are one of the important ways in which I think we can produce those boundary encounters, because we are essentially bringing other concepts and ideas that may have a home in another discipline. And here I think about, Dorothy Lerman's paper from last year where she talked about dissemination, and she talked about different audiences like first responders and how do we get behavior analysis to have an impact in with first responders. She does a great job of walking through how behavior analytic interventions and approaches can solve very real world problems for first responders, but that happens by bringing those two worlds together in a way that anybody who now is interested in improving the ways in which first responders do their work are going to be coming to the behavior analytic literature in ways that they maybe wouldn't have before. That incoming or outgoing boundary encounter can happen as a result.
Another part of the paper that was interesting is that you devoted some page space to talking about our tradition of single subject design or single case design, whatever you want to call it, and how that might be a limiting factor as it relates to dissemination. And can you talk about what your thoughts are as it relates to how these research design traditions may or may not facilitate dissemination and what we might do about that?
Sure. Yeah. And in the same way that I was kind of talking about the anxiety that comes from trying to publish in Java about publishing outside of Java, this is another one of those where, I don't want anyone to ever walk away from this paper and say, Nate Call says that single subject is the way of the dinosaurs or should be followed. That is not at all the message we're trying to convey.
Let me put your mind at ease. That was
No.
when you read the paper, it doesn't read that way. So you're good.
No, because it's absolutely the case that single subject methods have served the field incredibly well. That there are the kinds of demonstrations of behavior change and effects that can only be that are best captured through showing those causal relations and so on. So absolutely, I think single subject methods are critically important to the field. And in some ways, I think is partly what has made the field so innovative. The idea that we oftentimes are capturing repeated measures of behavior over time and then introducing independent variables and observing the impact in ways that we can collect a ton of data allow us to really be innovative in ways that would be impossible if you were trying to do group designs, for example, right? And so we as a field have gotten really good at using single subject methods to answer really important questions. But in one sense, the tool, and in this case, the design, sometimes seems like it is also dictating the subject matter, right? And that we've gotten really good at answering the kinds of questions that are best answered through single subject methods. One way I've thought about this is single subject data are really great at showing what is possible. And if I'm working individually as a clinician and I work in a center that serves kids with autism, if I'm working with a child with autism and I want to know what's possible for that kid, that's exactly the right tool for the job. And then if able to do that repeatedly over time, you have a data set and you can disseminate some of those findings. I think that's critically important work. But there are a lot of other questions that matter to behavior analysts, and especially to people outside of behavior analysis who are potentially consumers of behavior analysis, that are not always best answered with single subject methods. And I think one of the conversations I've had in various forms or another with people throughout my career has essentially been along the lines of, if only fill in the blank, if only teachers, or if only insurance companies, or if only policymakers would read Java, they would know that behavior analytic interventions are super powerful and can produce incredible outcomes. And then we would have, you know, better education and more reimbursement for behavior analytic services and so on. And I think one of the arguments is that if publishing more single subject papers in Java was going to solve that problem, then maybe it would be solved by now. And in the same way that, I had mentioned that I used to teach an undergraduate animal lab, and we would have students trying to get the shape up lever pressing on the part of the rat. And every semester when I taught this rat lab, I would have one set of undergraduates who would say, "You gave me the dumb rat," right? And we'd have to explain, it's not the rat, it's the problem, right? The rat is doing exactly what the contingencies have shaped, right? And I think as behavior analysts, we oftentimes sit back and say, well, the teachers, the insurance companies, the policymakers, we don't like their behavior. We wish their behavior would change. And then we keep doing the same thing anyway. And perhaps those kinds of questions that those constituencies, those audiences are interested in are sometimes better answered through other methods. And we can say, well, we think randomized controlled trials or group designs are wrong or flawed or have these issues. And it's not that none of that's true, but if they're the rat and that's the behavior they're emitting, just continuing to do the same thing isn't working. And so perhaps what we need to do is to think about, how do we appropriately, judiciously, thoughtfully, at the right time for the right kinds of questions, adopt some of those methods through that second generation innovation? How do we adopt those methods to answer the right kinds of questions in ways that then can produce uptake or produce some of those collective consequences that many of us say we are looking for?
So Nate, you make a great point, and I agree with the point that this single case approach may constrain the kinds of questions that we ask. And I think you alluded to one alternative mechanism, but I'm wondering if you could take a moment and describe a couple of alternative ways in which we might go about answering questions that are not within the kind of tried and true single case experimental design framework. What are the alternatives that you see as potentially fruitful as we move forward?
Yeah, yes, I mentioned RCTs, and RCTs are, if single subject methods are great for showing what's possible, RCTs are one way to show what's probable, which is important. There's a real downfall to those, that they are oftentimes very resource intensive, labor intensive. They require the kinds of resources that, like, large grants to conduct, and that's just not always in the cards for a lot of people who are practicing behavior analysis. But there are absolutely others. I think one that we talk about in the paper that is sometimes overlooked is implementation science. And I got to tell you, I have two faculty in my division that I work with closely who have this background in implementation science. And when I first kind of started hearing this term coming up, I remember saying something like, "Well, if you have to put science in the title of what you do, maybe you're being a little too, you're hitting it on the nose a little too hard, right?" But after having worked with some of these folks who really specialize in these areas of science, seeing the overlap, essentially implementation science is all about, how do we drive, how does one better understand the uptake, again, of any kind of intervention, right? And oftentimes this is done in medicine and other areas, but it's, if you have something that is already viewed as efficacious, we know that it can work, but it isn't implemented consistently. What are the steps and measures that one can do? And how do you study uptake then of those types of interventions? And again, I think that's right for behavior analysis. We're talking about behavior. We're talking about behavior of implementing interventions. And I think in some cases, behavior analytic work is already happening in this area. Things like, behavioral skills training, and how do we get teachers to implement procedures, and how do we make sure that there's maintenance of those effects. We don't necessarily talk about it in that way, but certainly there's an opportunity to pull from some of these other areas that do this work, maybe using other methods, using other terms, other frameworks, but starting to see the blending of those ideas in ways that we could start to, as a field, really have impact in a whole other discipline, because the expertise and the science of what we do is so powerful, but hasn't oftentimes really been framed in that way from the people who do that work now.
I think those are great examples. There are others that you mentioned in the paper, and one that I think is gaining considerable traction in behavior analysis, but is well researched and evidence supported outside of behavior analysis, is this notion of participatory action research. And one of the things that I think is so important about that kind of brand or area of research is that it really does reflect a lot of the values that I think we as behavior analysts have, but it shines a light on them and perhaps is an opportunity to emphasize what's important about that. So could you just briefly describe what that means and perhaps how it's connected to what we do in applied behavior analysis?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. So, I think about, participatory research for me is really all about social validity. And again, like, as to your point, the values of what we as a discipline that we hold are oftentimes, again, about this. We are implementing, or we are trying to drive outcomes that matter to somebody, and that social validity aspect. If you look at how I was trained, or how behavior analysts oftentimes assess social validity, I wouldn't say it necessarily adheres to some of the best practices. Oftentimes, what we do is we design. We see a problem, or we read about a problem. We design an intervention. We go implement it. We track the outcomes using a single subject design or something along those lines, and then we go to the people who were part of that, the consumers or whomever, and we say, hand them a checkbox that says, "Do you like me? Yes or no? Check this box." Right, and then we stand over their shoulder while they fill it out, and, oh, by the way, there's a lot of evidence that people almost always like something better than nothing. So, we almost always look really good from a social validity standpoint when that's how it's being assessed. And yet, what the participatory research really is about is the idea that before you even go implement any kind of intervention or design an intervention, step one is to really make sure we understand the perspective of the people who are being affected by that we understand the problem from their standpoint, and we understand what kinds of solutions are acceptable to them before we go do anything else. The example I like to give is, a colleague and I, she was a junior faculty member here, and she had this idea. We work in our complex behavior supports unit. And so a lot of kids with significant challenging behavior, where families oftentimes find themselves in a crisis and need to call first responders. And I remember we at the time were talking about, like, how might we improve some of the interactions we were hearing about from those families. They were saying things like, the parent got cuffed, the kid got tased, really bad outcomes. And so thought about, well, maybe we should do like a first responder training. And this was around the time of some of the George Floyd protests and stuff like this. This was, I think, pre-COVID, if I remember right. And we live in Atlanta, and we had a conversation about how even that decision to call first responders looks really different depending on who you are and where you live. If you look like me, you live in the suburbs of Atlanta and you have a crisis and you call first responders, that's one calculus you make. But you live in another part of Atlanta and you're from an ethnic or racial minority group, calling first responders has a very different set of implications for you. And so I remember we talked to some first responders. We actually got some police to talk with us, and they kind of said, "You know what? If you do a training like this, that'll be great. Like, we will sit attentively, we will listen, we will try our best to pass your assessment at the end of the 6-hour training. But if you come back 6 months later and just ask us what we retained, it's going to be low." They said, "We do everything under the sun. We do traffic stops, we do drug busts, we do all kinds of things. And just the retention of any one bit of information that's delivered in a workshop type format is not likely to be high." So the idea we came up with was, let's do some participatory work. Let's really stop and talk to the people involved. And that was part of it, first starting with the first responders. And that really shaped, okay, maybe that's not the way to go. But in then doing some focus groups with families to understand, okay, well, what matters for them? And we learned a ton of really important information about what help looks like for them on this issue. And we heard things like, when families are in crisis, there's a kid in the front yard throwing furniture. It's often not the families who call the first responders, it's the neighbor. And maybe what we need to do is to train families to go to their neighbors and talk to them in advance and say, "If you see my kid in the front lawn throwing furniture, this is what help looks like for us." right? And talking with the families about how they could have a script so that if they do have to call first responders, who's going to pick up the phone? What's the first question they're going to ask? What do you need to report to them so that they get the information in as concise a way as possible? So when people show up, I was just talking to a colleague today and we were doing some work looking at some of this and actually looked at outcomes of these first responder events and what were the predictors of things going well versus a kid getting restrained or an adult getting restrained or use of force type escalation. You'll be fascinated by at least what he told me. The number one predictor of whether or not there was escalation or de-escalation was whether or not the responding officer was a female. And so starting to think about, okay, why would that be the case, right? And understanding how that might actually come into play and why would females respond differently? Maybe it's their size, maybe it's, something else, we don't know. But anyway, this idea of understanding the issue from the perspective of those people who are going to be affected before we go out and just design something or come up with a solution to make sure that the solution actually is going to affect the audience in the way that that everybody wants.
Those are great examples. And as you were describing them, my mind was spinning with all sorts of other applications. I mean, that's just taking that perspective in any type of intervention is, can certainly.
But I think one of the things that's tricky again is behavior analysts talking about the transition from single subject work to RCTs, that's a big jump, right? But it's still quantitative. We're talking about outcome measures, that kind of. The jump to participatory research, to do it in the way that is kind of published increasingly, and there are outlets that do that type of work. That now you're talking about qualitative research. You're talking about focus groups and conducting learning terms like saturation and how do you do thematic analysis of transcripts. And our group had done some of those now for different audiences different consumer groups, and it is an entirely different leap to be making. But I think as behavior analysts, there's a lot that we can learn from that work, and I would encourage more people to take the jump if they find themselves in those kinds of and increasingly, if you want to do things like get federal funding for any kind of work these days that's intervention based, they're requiring that you have done some kind of participatory work, even to the degree of having individuals who are from the group that you're trying to work with serve as co-investigators in your research. And that, again, I think is more and more common. See it less in behavior analysis, but I think it's an important thing to at least be thinking about how we can live those principles in ways that probably adhere to some of these expectations.
Nate, as an aside, I took a few graduate level qualitative research courses a few years ago, and I'm going to be perfectly candid. It was hard for me to get through them because the general premise here, and if someone's an expert in this, they you're welcome to email me and tell me that I've got this wrong. But my recollection at the time is that this is an information gathering process, but really the extent to which it has like internal and external validity in the ways in which we were taught as scientists. Those facets of those research products were extremely limited, and so I, as a younger person with less wisdom, I was like, well, what's the point, But I could see how that would influence what kind of it's a process that makes you ask better research questions.
Yes,
and get more buy-in as a result. And so, I'm less, I guess, skeptical of the utility of those types of investigations, even if, or at least approximating something like that as a part of a quantitative research endeavor.
But again, I think this is one of those things where I think behavior analysts already do a lot of this stuff.
Yes.
We don't always do it using the kind of accepted approaches that are being used in other disciplines. But, when we come to develop an intervention for a patient or a client or a family, best practice and dictates you sit down and try to have a conversation with them and say things like, hey, if this works, how is your life going to be different? Right? Like that's a very normal question to be asking someone, but we tend to do it informally and not necessarily report it. And not necessarily, I think it happens all the time.
And we don't get taught how to do it well either.
I was talking to a colleague very recently where we were talking about collaborating on a project, and we kind of said, look, if you just add this much structure to what you're doing now, there's a whole second paper here, right? Where you could take work you're already doing, but just add a little bit of structure to the kinds of conversations you're having anyway.
I want to jump in here. This is a great conversation. I think that it is really important for us to acknowledge, and this is what I would prefer, that we acknowledge that there is a science to those qualitative approaches. Matt, you got to take classes in this, so somebody is studying this, and I think that we border on arrogance when we do not adopt the methods that are scientifically and empirically supported outside of our discipline. So if I say I'm going to run a focus group, but I do none of the legwork to understand how to run a focus group, then I am going to be a poor exemplar of a behavior analyst attempting to contribute to that literature. But one of the points that I keep pulling from this is that there's a lot of education and training that's required here. You're going to have to understand how to conduct an RCT. You're going to have to understand how to conduct an evaluations of effect sizes. You're going to have to understand how to do thematic analyses from focus groups and so on. So there are really complex skills that are involved here. And if we do the work in an incomplete fashion, then we, as behavior analysts, are poor exemplars of that work. And then I think it has a negative trickle-down effect. So I view considerable value, and to Matt's point, as in these qualitative methods as complements to what we already do very, very well. And finding opportunities to incorporate that into our work, I think, will enhance dissemination, because when other scholars can see, oh, this group of behavior analysts ran a focus group on a topic that I'm also interested in, then that increases the likelihood of those boundary encounters and those outgoing instances of distribution and hopefully dissemination.
Yeah, and to introduce another term that we use in the paper, the idea of brokers, right? Brokers are these individuals who kind of straddle two disciplines. And there are, again, very prominent examples of behavior analysts who play that role, who have one foot in one discipline and another in behavior analysis. And those are the folks who oftentimes are able to do exactly what you're describing. They've developed mastery of a skill set related to some other line of work or type of research and bring behavior analysis into that. And so certainly that's something that folks can develop and cultivate that expertise. But the other thing is to find collaborators, right? Finding people who possess that expertise, who maybe don't have the background in behavior analysis. And I don't know about you, but my experience has been when you start talking to people about the kinds of problems and challenges that behavior analysts are really good at solving and the kinds of data and evidence that we collect in just our everyday work, people get pretty excited about it. The face validity of our work is so high, right? The kinds of behavior changes that we can produce for things that seem like insurmountable problems for other groups. I think in the paper we talk about some of the work we did on elopement, right? We did a consecutive controlled case series analysis of treating, I think we did pica first. We've done pica and elopement, right? But when we published that paper, and specifically, we weren't doing anything new. The people who've been studying how to do function-based treatments or behavioral interventions for pica have innovated way before we came along. But the idea was taking that and putting that in front of an audience who hadn't seen it before. And we published that in a journal that hadn't really published behavioral intervention work on that topic in the past. And the response we got was incredible. I mean, I got an email from the Iranian Journal of Nursing saying, we thought this was an untreatable problem. And this showing that behavior analysts were producing not just occasionally good outcomes, but reliably good outcomes for a behavior that was seemingly insurmountable. There are lots of examples of that. That's just one. But I think when you start showing data the way that we are able to show data and the kinds of problems that we're able to solve, I have not had problems finding collaborators who are interested in trying to apply their expertise to tackling those kinds of problems. Part of it is being good colleagues, right? I think behavior analysts, I think historically have had a reputation of being somewhat dogmatic. My perception is that is kind of waning. I don't think I see that same kind of issue as when I was first getting started in the field, but certainly if that's an issue that people have to combat, there's got to be a willingness to view the work that other people are doing as equally valid and important, even if they're using methods like qualitative research that we maybe are trained to think very differently about, or in the past may have been. But, that's exactly how some of this work has gotten done for the group that I work with, is to bring in people who are experts in qualitative research and help us run that focus group and help us do thematic analysis. And once you've done one or two of those, now there's a skill set. You've become a broker. You've now got the ability to do that for the next idea, the next project, and the next.
I just want to jump in here real quick. The paper I believe you're referring to is Carr excuse me, Call et al. Car's right below it, and I'm looking at the reference list here. 2015 clinical outcomes of behavioral treatments for pica in children with developmental disabilities, and that was in the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disabilities. So presumably an outlet that has perhaps a broader readership. And again, for people listening along, I've got a full page of notes here in my notebook. It's all going to be in the show notes over at behavioralobservations.com with links to everything. So don't pull the car over. Don't get off the treadmill. So keep listening. We'll have it all in the show notes. So anyway, I just want to put that out there so people know where to look. So yeah, I was going to ask you about that paper specifically, but we've already covered that, as well as the importance of collaboration as well. If there's more to say on that, have at it. But I also wanted to, as we kind of round out this discussion here, and curious about ways to, I think there's a part of the paper towards the end about, how do we know we're doing better with regard to this sort of thing? So how do we measure our progress when it comes to not distribution, but dissemination, or at least closer to the dissemination end of the spectrum, as you so rightly termed it earlier?
Yeah, we this idea of I'd use the term meta science, right? So how do we do science about science? How do we study the work that we're doing in scholarship and whether it's producing uptake? Again, this is something that is being done in other areas and in other disciplines that we would seem to be perfectly positioned to do this kind of work, right? Because it's all, if we're thinking about scholarship as behavior, we're all about behavior. That seems like right in our wheelhouse. One of the challenges is finding the right DV, right? What is the dependent variable, dependent measure for when something is actually having an impact or not? We did some work in an early draft of the paper where we did some bibliographic network analysis, for example, and actually looked at the network of things like co-citations. So when something is published alongside another paper, that would be an example of in the same work, that would be an example of a co-citation. And there's software that you can use that will actually build a network that shows which journals are related to which other journals and in what proximity and how frequently they're appearing alongside one another. And then we'll cluster those based on themes that seem to appear and how closely networked they are. And it was really fascinating to look at things like, I think we did a bibliographic network analysis for JABA. Not a big surprise that the journal with the greatest proximity, the closest network was JAB, of course, which you would expect, right? But then you start looking at what are some of these other nodes of the network, and you start to see one node that was focused on animal behavior, and another node that was focused on autism, and another was on developmental disability, and one was on medicine and healthcare. And you start to look at these nodes, and I think one of the things we're interested in doing is looking at how do these things shift over time? Do we see that these kinds of dependent variables start to be able to quantify impact and uptake, at least as it relates to other fields? And again, if you're talking about these nodes that are maybe not so proximal, are we starting to have an impact in those areas in ways that right now we're not? Now, I would say that's a lagging indicator, but certainly it is an indicator. And right now, when we have a lack of other measures, that would be one way to try to track, and also be able to look retrospectively at some of the journals and outlets that we've been able to impact based on which types of work. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for those kinds of measures. And then there's others. Tom Critchfield had a paper not so long ago where he looked at the altmetric measures. So things like mentions in social media, for example, and something that oftentimes we think of as the only outlet that matters is publication in a peer-reviewed journal. But if what we're trying to do is to drive uptake, and a lot of the people who consume science are consuming it through things like social media, how are we going to drive those kinds of messages to audiences through outlets like that? I thought that was a really insightful couple of papers that they published on that topic. I think it was Galino and Critchfield that done that work.
Yeah,
I think
Tom's work
one
is heavily cited here. So yeah, sure. Go ahead, John. I'm sorry.
Here's one more. Critchfield I think it was 2024, he published a policy analysis to essentially document how frequently JABA papers appeared in policy documents. And when we're talking about level of influence, if we have a particular policy that is going to impact all public school educated children, that's the kind of venue in which we can really talk about dissemination. And this is something that millions of children would experience as part of their everyday education. So I think policy influence is another one of those. The other that you didn't mention, and I think I understand why, is just this notion of citations generally. And one point that I'd like to make about citations is I think I would encourage every single one of us to become very, very thoughtful about the papers that we cite. Because sometimes I think we get into the business of citing a paper as a non-example of something or something that we want to de-emphasize. But the important point there is that that paper still gets a +1 citation when we cited that work. So if there's a better exemplar that is better reflective of the contemporary approaches that we're taking, better reflective of a set of procedures that we want to use, please cite that paper. Don't cite the paper that you think is a little sketchy and may not make the most substantive contribution. So I think as scholars, we need to be very thoughtful about the papers that we're including in our citations, because if I'm adding to a citation count for a paper that I think is questionable or of lower quality, it's giving that paper attention. And I think we need to be thoughtful about that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. It's not like the Reddit thumbs up, thumbs down count. It doesn't work. Well, again, Nate, congrats on such a thorough review of the topic. The effort expended going through this and making all the notes was well worth it. And again, I would encourage the listeners to consider putting in that, setting some time aside, get your cup of coffee and get your notebook, highlighters, etc., and just go to town on this. It's well worth your time. I'd like to close the podcast with some advice for the newly minted BCBA, Nate. So whether it's in the realm of dissemination or just things that you've observed that might be helpful for newer people in the field, or as I sometimes say, BCBAs of any experience level, because sometimes we learn things and we forget them and then we relearn them and, et cetera. So this is your opportunity to kind of have at it.
Yeah. So, the paper, we've really focused on a couple of sections that we described as more strategies, right? High level things that the field could do or individuals could do, but that are not really accessible to every type of behavior analyst out there. And so the latter part of the paper we described as tactics, and that differentiation between strategies are the big picture ideas that we want to try to drive, and the tactics are the things that just about anybody should be able to adopt one or more of these approaches. And we actually really focused on including tactics that even trainees could implement. And so I think things like, as a trainee, but also, like you said, a newly minted BCBA, being thoughtful about the literature you consume and being a voracious consumer of literature beyond some, and it's hard enough, right? Believe me, I understand it's hard enough to stay out on top of our own literature, much less try to delve deeply into literatures outside of our own. But I think that is one of those things that what we consume is really going to help shape our experience and our ability to become fluent in some of these terms and concepts and methods, as well as make us better collaborators, right? By understanding a little bit better about the literature outside of the ones that we most frequently participate, becoming more fluent in those other literatures is one of the main things I think that just about anybody should be able to do.
Excellent. All right. That's great advice to end with. And John, congrats again. It's been really fun collaborating with you these last several years. It kind of went by like in a blink, which is kind of crazy. And I'll have to have you back to actually talk about your own research, because you've spent the last couple of years talking about other people's stuff. It's, so I'd like to have you back when maybe it's not that the Zoom screen doesn't look like a, kind of like a Brady Bunch, intro. So again, congrats on all the hard work. And yeah, it's been a lot of fun. And yeah, thank both of you. Thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you, Matt.
Just to echo, John, that it is a frequently thankless job. And so just on behalf of many, many, many people, just the gratitude for steering the ship during the last 3 years. The journalism has been advanced in really significant and important ways under your stewardship. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Nate. Thank you, Matt.
All right, that's going to do it for the 25th edition of the Inside JABA Series podcast. Thanks again, guys.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.